Good evening and welcome to a special edition of the Drive at 5 on IntellectualRadio.com/iHeart radio station. I'm your host, Roman. Tonight, we will discuss the coronavirus or COVID-19. There is a lot of misinformation that is out there, and people are playing around with this virus and treating it like it's a game. The serious nature of the reason why we are in a lockdown mode or situation, and to get some type of understanding or clarity of its nature and how did we get to this point, please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Sterling, who is a physician, author, speaker, executive, and international leader in community-based medicine, healthcare, and public health. He served as president and CEO of Sterling Initiatives, a healthcare consulting and implementation firm, assisting entities incorporate best practice. On the intellectual line, please give a Drive at 5 welcome to Dr. Jeffrey Sterling. Welcome to the Drive. Welcome back to the Drive, sir.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, please help us define coronavirus and how did we get to this point? Because some doctors say this virus has been around for some decades. However, not to this extent. Can you explain that to us?
Well, you were correct in that there are plenty of misconceptions about it all. Coronavirus is just a name for a family of viruses. That's it. So whereas it is true that there have been coronaviruses in our lives for a long period of time, as a matter of fact, coronavirus itself is one of the entities that is the most frequent common causes of the common cold, okay? But COVID-19 is a new entity. So COVID-19 is one of the members of the coronavirus family. So everything that is coronavirus is not COVID-19, but COVID-19, which is new, a novel or new coronavirus, is a relatively new phenomenon. And that entity is the cause of the disease that we're worried about right now.
There is a lot of misinformation and fear mongering going on in social media and in the news. What kind of myths you want to dispel about the virus? Some say it's airborne, some say it's not. Which myths that you want to dispel? Because there's a whole host of it that's out there.
Well, how much time do we have? I mean, there are a ton of myths, but I think that we can do this any way you want, but I'm into empowering people and giving them accurate information. But I think the first order of business is to get people to know the basics about the disease. Now, to answer your question, all respiratory illnesses, and this is certainly a respiratory illness, are propagated by these what's called a viral droplet. Imagine, if you will, a snot bubble, and reduce it by 1,000,000 times. There are these viral droplets, or these snot bubbles, if you will. I'm being overly simplistic. Apologies to any physicians in the audience, that contain the virus. And when you sneeze, cough, breathe, or exchange fluids with somebody by kissing, or just breathe heavily on someone, those droplets can get transmitted one person to the other. That is far and away the overwhelming mode of transmission. So whereas the rest of the things that we talk about in terms of it staying on surfaces and all the rest of that are certainly true, job number one is the same way that the flu and the common cold show up this time of year. This is primarily a respiratory disease. That doesn't mean it's the only way that you can acquire it, but that's the primary way that people should be concerned, which is why we talk about social distancing as much as we do.
You mentioned several severe respiratory diseases that causes irreversible lung damage in your Facebook post. Also, you mentioned that respiratory damage creates reducibility of the lung to deliver oxygen throughout the body to the brain, heart, and other tissues, often becoming the cause of death. My first question is, what is the several severe respiratory diseases or acute respiratory distress syndrome? you can elaborate on, and that is irreversible, that you said can, like the COVID-19, is a disease that creates the acute respiratory distress syndrome?
Okay, well, first things first, let's get overly simplistic. The purpose of the lungs is to exchange oxygen. Okay, so the bottom line is you breathe in air, and air contains oxygen, and your lungs are a wonderful template to absorb the oxygen from the air on one side to the bloodstream on the other side. The purpose of that oxygen is to then go around and to nourish the rest of your body, including your brain, your heart, your legs, everything else that's going on inside of you. Anything that disrupts that normally pristine environment, that atmosphere, can cause a big muck on your lungs. And most fundamentally, we have to begin the conversation pointing out that this is why cigarettes are so dangerous. I just told you that you have a pristine area inside of your body that's meant for the clean exchange of oxygen. Imagine what happens when you dump a bunch of smoke into that place. Okay? So that's why we talk about smoke. Anything that damages the lung tissue reduces the amount of tissue that's available for you to exchange oxygen across that surface area. So there are many ways to damage that surface area, that tissue that we need to deliver oxygen to our blood and throughout our body. Cigarette smoke can do it by directly irritating and impacting your lung tissue, and viruses can do the same thing. So if you actually got a virus that had hooks on it, for example, that wanted to pick apart the lung tissue and thus damage it in that way, then that is another mechanism by which your lung tissue can be reduced and you can have less surface area available to exchange oxygen, and that causes damage. If you do that long enough, and if you damage enough of the surface area, you are ineffective in delivering oxygen, and the end result of that is that there's not oxygen flowing throughout your body, and then if oxygen doesn't get to your heart, that's called a heart attack. If it doesn't get to your brain, that's called a stroke. So one of the problems with COVID is that it's one of the entities that actually hangs onto your lungs, damages your lungs, and once again, imagine, if you will, if you had some type of sponge and you took your hands and just tore out big sheets of the sponge, well, that sponge is not going to regenerate. So the disease that some things cause, and this is true with cigarette smoke after age 35, for example, and it's true with certain types of illnesses such as the COVID and other diseases like sarcoidosis that you may have heard of. There are many or several diseases that cause that difficulty. And when you reach a threshold at which the lung, so much of the damage has occurred that you no longer are able to functionally meet the demands of the body by delivering that oxygen, you get into a state called acute respiratory distress syndrome, where you're just not getting enough air across that template to help your body do what it needs to do.
You mentioned, let's say, secondhand smoke. Can that also result to adding an acute respiratory problem? If you secondhand smoke, you don't smoke, but you inhale, is that could be some of the problems as well?
Of course, once again, you have a pristine area. It's kind of like our lungs when we were born are a Garden of Eden, to use an analogy there. And the more smoke, we use in medicine, we say something to the extent that every cigarette you smoke takes 7 minutes off of your life. So you're able to quantify the amount of damage that's being done with every assault that occurs to the lungs, whether it's cigarettes directly, whether it's secondhand smoke, or whether it's through some type of disease that over a period of time causes irreversible damage.
What about someone who's, let's say, for example, use e-cigarettes or maybe smoke marijuana, for example? A lot of people I wouldn't say a lot, but some people are smoking marijuana. There are some people that are smoking e-cigarettes. Could that result to what we have now in younger people to acquire this COVID-19?
Anything that disrupts the pristine environment in which oxygen is being delivered across the surface area can cause different degrees of difficulties with your breathing. There's a continuum that ranges from just irritation that gets reversed That's what asthma is. Any type of irritation on your lungs causes the accumulation of products of inflammation, which is the equivalent of snotting your lungs and you wheeze and try to clear it out. But that's reversible. And then you get to bronchitis. And if you continue to do that for a period of time and get to, say, age 35, to where your body has a diminished ability to heal itself, then the damages become more permanent, and you get things like chronic bronchitis or COPD. Members of our family, of the audience's family, certainly will recognize that one. Emphysema, and leading up to cancer. So, whereas it's okay to look at something like e-cigarettes and say, well, that doesn't cause cancer. Well, that's not the only concern that you should have. There are different levels of damage that occur, and though that damage is cumulative, and over time they can cause more problems than you want to deal with. So the best way to go is to avoid self-imposed wounds to your lungs, but you do have to appreciate that different things cause different levels of damage, meaning that the damage is more likely to occur quicker and produce effects more severely, more promptly.
So you're saying like people who have bronchitis, asthma, any breathing difficulties, they're more susceptible to COVID-19, correct?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
Anybody's susceptible to COVID-19. The people that are most susceptible to COVID-19 are people who are immunocompromised, who can't fight it off with our natural immune systems, and people who are elderly enough such that they, by process, just have a diminished immune system. So, the issue here, look, once your body is weaker, and this is why preventive health is such an important consideration, once you get older and weaker in life, your defenses against any type of viruses tend to be diminished. If you are an immunocompromised patient and you get something like chickenpox, that disease itself can turn into something that's much more dangerous, much more virulent, and in some cases can actually be fatal. So it's all about what your baseline level of health is, what your baseline immune status is, and what you're exposing yourself to.
A lot of people are not asking these questions to health professionals, so I'm going to ask it to you. What about women who are pregnant, newborn babies, or people regarding the COVID-19 virus or coronavirus? How should they handle this situation if you're pregnant, like 6 months pregnant, or let's say you're about to have a baby, or you just had a baby, you have a newborn? What should they do?
Well, you should do the same things that anybody would do. The name of the game is that if you have a baseline level of good health, then you are largely covered by all of this. I can't emphasize that enough. There is no pill that you're going to take or no magic that's going to protect you from anything. The name of the game here is that we are faced with disease all day, every day. Our bodies are just wonderfully equipped to fight these things off, and we take that for granted. And if you have a baseline level of health that's strong, you enjoy the benefit of being able to not think about these things because you're taking care of yourself, and your body is empowered to address the vast majority of what ails you, and it will protect you. So, it's more dramatic to think in terms of a newborn baby or a pregnant mom, but for various reasons, those individuals are well situated to fight this off. You would hope that a mother, an expecting mother, is taking prenatal vitamins and other considerations that will put her in a good position to deliver a child. If that's the case, that mother, that expected mother, may be in a better position than most to actually fight off colds and other types of so-called nuisance illnesses that may arise during pregnancy. And with respect to COVID, we know that kids seem to be less affected than elderly individuals, which is nice to see. So that's not as big of a worry as it typically is, and having to worry about defenseless kids who haven't developed a full immune system as of yet. The real target here are people with diminished immune systems and elderly patients, particularly those over 60 years old.
Okay, so in regards to newborn we shouldn't be worried about that, or we should?
No, I didn't say that. So
Okay.
you should be look. You should be concerned about everything. You shouldn't be necessarily panicked about any of this. The point to be made is that if you are engaged in a healthy lifestyle and are dealing with an appropriate diet, good activity and exercise, and just taking care of yourself, then you don't have to be obsessed with whether or not COVID-19 is coming to get you. There are diseases in the air and otherwise around us all day, every day that are out to get us. The point to be made is that if you are healthy, your body is able to fight off the vast majority of what ails you. All of us, the data shows that 80% of people, even after they get infected with COVID, respond spontaneously and recover without symptoms. So once again, in the normal person with a normal baseline of good health, there's not a need to be overly concerned about this because it will be eliminated by your own natural defenses.
You posed the question on your Facebook page of what should we be doing to protect ourselves from the COVID pandemic beyond the isolation activity. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. Well, I mean, once again, this is a situation where you're going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. What's different about COVID is that we can become carriers of the disease even without us having developed symptoms from the disease. And the problem with that is that we then take the disease and in our carrier states, and then we go visit our mothers, grandmothers, or friends who are otherwise sick with diminished immune systems, and we can pass the disease on to them. And truthfully, that is where the big danger is. So the number one group of things that we should be doing beyond just protecting ourselves is being mindful that we have a responsibility to the most vulnerable of us in the community, in our families, and in societies. So this is a new burden. We typically don't think in terms of, I have to be extra diligent, not just for myself, but for other members of the community. And that's a new paradigm. We typically don't think that way, and it's an extra responsibility. And some people, like the kids you see playing on the beaches on the coast, don't accept that responsibility. But when that happens, it ends up proving to be devastating to somebody in their circle at some point in time.
What about your pets that come in and outdoors? Um, you have to walk them. And what about taking your pets to the dog park? What should a pet owner should be doing if they walk their dog or take their dog to a dog park during this epidemic? Pets are not affected by the virus, however, can carry it and affect you. Am I right or wrong with this assessment?
That's actually a good question, but it's rather esoteric. I think the long and short of it is that, and again, allow me to make sure that we don't overemphasize certain types of things that just aren't common. Common things happen commonly, and the truth of the matter, as you mentioned, they aren't going to be affected even if they can be carriers. So, in other words, if you follow the same considerations that we've been talking about, which are specifically are to maintain social distancing amongst people, make sure that you're washing the objects that you handle, wash your hands when you're handling objects before and after. And, the basic considerations that we continue to talk about, that will keep you in good stead. And that will keep you in good stead for a dozen different examples of things that we do. There's not nuance to this. There aren't 15 different things you need to appreciate for 15 different scenarios and circumstances. Long and short of it is that you need to keep yourself clean. You need to keep yourself healthy. You need to keep social distancing in place. You need to avoid congregating amongst large groups of people. And that's pretty much the name of the game.
On social media outlets and throughout, and this is kind of like some of the myths, and that's why I'm asking some of these questions to kind of like dispel it. Some medical professions say the coronavirus is spreading similar to HIV and AIDS epidemic. What are your thoughts that people in the profession using this comparison? However, medical experts say they don't know if you can't get it through sexual intercourse or contact sexually. However, they want distancing to play a role in this. It's kind of like mixed information. Can you at least explain a little bit about that?
Well, I might ask you to clarify the question if I don't address it in total, but
Okay.
that's a distinction without a difference. If sexual intercourse is including you kissing, breathing, and exchanging of fluids from your mouth to the other person's mouth, for example, then in fact sexual activity can transmit the disease. If you're just thinking about the acts of intercourse, no. Once again, think about it in terms of this is a respiratory disease predominantly, and if you engage in activities where air is exchanged, then that's the predominant mode. However, I do want to say this, and I'm glad you circled back around to this point. I do want you to know that contact does pose certain specific problems. So, for example, the virus can survive up to 4 hours on copper, 24 hours on cardboard, 2 to 3 days on plastic and stainless steel. So, to the extent to which you're utilizing or touching or holding on to those types of surfaces, then the virus, if it's there, can be transmitted if you go from, for example, plastic or stainless to your hands to another person's hand, and that person then takes it from their hand and puts it in their eyes, nose, or mouth, then that actually can be a mode of transmission. But by all means, common things happen commonly. There's a way in which this most likely is being transmitted is through coughing, sneezing, and other respiratory modes of transmission. But it definitely is happening the other way as well, which is why we encourage people to take all of those additional precautions.
According to your Facebook post, is the actual current criteria that is being or should be used to determine if you should be seeking testing and whether or not facilities should be accommodating your request for testing. Can you explain to us on intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station, what are those criteria to seek medical attention?
Well, I'm going to start with something that is intuitive, common sense, and reachable by members of the listening audience, because there is a law called prudent layperson. This is actually a federal law that suggests that anybody out there that believes that they are in the midst of a life-threatening emergency actually has the right to be seen. So I don't want to go overboard, and I want to say this at the beginning of this, I don't want to go overboard in saying that people should stay home. However, the truth of the matter is that there are best practices, objective criteria that suggest who is most likely to benefit from coming. You shouldn't engage physically, that is, a hospital or an urgent care facility, for example, out of your fear. You should have knowledge and understand when you should actually engage the system, because if you go, then you're not in the priority categories. Even though I have some issues with how the category is structured, then you won't get the test and you'll be frustrated and you may leave frustrated. So the priority criteria mainly include, number one, if you're critically ill, that's kind of a self-evident truth. You're not sitting at home critically ill, but if you came in and you were having just pretty dramatic respiratory failure or or inability to breathe, regardless of whether you traveled or had close contact with anyone that's known to have COVID-19, you'll get the test. Secondly, anybody who's had a fever, a respiratory tract infection, and a history of a close contact with somebody who is known to have COVID-19 within 14 days of your symptoms, you'll get a test. So in other words, more or less, anybody that's in an acute care facility or a nursing home or assisted living facility, if somebody in there gets COVID-19 and develops a fever or lower tract infection, they're going to get a test. And close contact is defined as being within 6 feet of that person, which is why we talk about that 1.5 arm's length that you should try to keep between you and someone else as a measure of social distancing. Similarly, there are people, namely physicians and other healthcare personnel, that if we've been exposed and developed symptoms, then healthcare personnel really need to be in the high priority category of people that ended up being tested. There are 3 more categories. One, individuals who have symptoms and have been traveling abroad over the last 14 days to any geographic region where there's been sustained community transmission. That's a group that needs to be tested, which is why we want to screen you when you come back in from out of the country if you've been over to Europe or to China, for example, because it's endemic over there. Similarly, individuals who have diminished immune systems and are at risk for poor outcomes and are symptomatic, they need to be tested. So if you're greater than 65, if you have a suppressed immune system, or if you have high-risk chronic medical conditions like diabetes, heart disease, chronic lung disease, or chronic kidney disease, and you start getting a cough or fever, you need to be tested. Finally, if you are a so-called critical individual, such as healthcare personnel, public health official, or other essential leaders, and you develop fever and symptoms of a respiratory tract illness, you'll get tested. So there are 5 big categories of individuals that are prioritized in terms of getting tested. And that is simply for the purpose of most definitively utilizing the available supply. There's plenty of reasons why there should be a much broader scope of testing, but due to the rather limited number of supplies that are available, at this point, the testing has been allocated to those groups of individuals.
A lot of people are not asking these questions, so I'm going to pose this question to you, and I know may or may not, and there's still information that's going on. What about the dead? What about people who died from the coronavirus and they have to deal with the body? How long will that virus stay in that body? Because again, you're talking about 9 people died in the state of Illinois thus far, and it's constantly rising of the infection that's been going on, that people that obtained the virus. However, what should we do with people who are dying from the virus, the dead bodies from this virus?
Well, that's a good question, but once again, I think that that's more of a question out of fear and legitimate concern than anything that's scientifically important to stress folks out over. Remember, the disease in any entity is transmitted in very specific ways. And given that the dead aren't breathing on you, coughing on you, or sneezing on you, that eliminates a lot of the worry that you should have about getting the virus from someone who is a corpse or someone you're visiting at a funeral. So that's a huge category of concern that you can eliminate. It's a respiratorily transmitted disease by these viral droplets that are traveling through the air. Secondly, in as much as the virus may have been on a deceased person's body and it can last there for a couple of days, theoretically, there might be some concern. If you discovered a body at home, for example, and needed to take it in, there's a theoretical concern that people who are doing CPR without a mask or touching parts of the body, their hands, for example, if they coughed themselves to death, for example, those are theoretical considerations. But if you're visiting somebody at a funeral, or if you're a funeral home worker or an ambulance worker, you're always going to be engaging these individuals while you are wearing personal protective equipment. And if you're wearing personal protective equipment, and this is why it's so important for all this equipment to be available to essential healthcare and personal care workers, you'll be protected. So of the subset of people that are exposed to dead bodies, the most at-risk individuals probably would be someone who discovers a deceased family member at home, engaged in seemingly heroic efforts to save that person and touch them and gave them mouth to mouth, not knowing that they were positive for COVID-19. So there's a theoretical risk for that, but it's very unlikely that if you went to someone's funeral, that any of the engagements that occurred would result in transmission of the disease from someone's deceased to you.
Medical supplies are running out, and the CDC is saying you can use your face mask multiple times if you use hand sanitizers or sanitize it. However, you are breathing the effects of the hand sanitizer if it's mixed with alcohol. What is your opinion? Should a person use hand sanitizers or any sanitizer in order to reuse the mask? And how many times a person can use a face mask before you need to throw it away?
Depends on who a person is. Uh, that is an absolutely horrible recommendation for a healthcare worker. In normal circumstances, a nurse or a physician or some other healthcare worker would literally be fired for using a piece of personal protective equipment more than once. The majority of these pieces of equipment are meant for single use because the point is that in the example in which you're using them, you only put it on because you're exposing yourself to a person that represents some type of risk. Obviously, you do not want to transmit that risk to the next person. So PPE, as we call it, personal protective equipment, is not meant to be used for a day or for a week. It creates an additional danger. Now, just as there are expiration dates on medications and foods that represent a day or two or a month or two quicker than you actually need to get rid of it, there appears to be, and again, this is speaking to the logic of the CDC on this one, there appears to be some give in the notion that you absolutely must dispose of these things right away. And they have come up with the conditions under which these things can be reused. But personally, I would never advocate for that. I would actually suggest that it is shameful that the response hasn't been to galvanize the corporate apparatus in this country to simply increase the supply. There's nothing in this conversation that suggests that we shouldn't be able to increase the supply of these pieces of medical equipment and supplies. They're being made all around the world. We can just import them. And, you know, this is America. We can mass produce whatever we want to. The goal is not just to focus on the demand side and to say we use equipment or don't show up and don't overwhelm the system. Those are valid in some instances, but you know, you can't do one without suggesting that the other way to flatten the curve is to make sure that when patients do come and we do need to use pieces of PPE, that we're not exposing them to additional concerns. So we really have to place a caveat to your concern by saying you have to increase the supply so that there are adequate amounts of personal protective equipment for the medical staff, such that we can protect patients. It's really just that simple.
The CDC said you can use bandanas to cover yourself. That is effective, according to the CDC. There is also a myth going around on social media that you can use a bra as a face mask. Will that be acceptable or more effective since the CDC said you can use a bandana? Maybe you can use a person's bra to as a face mask or something like that.
Yeah, these are horrible recommendations, quite frankly. The logic is, first of all, let's just say this emphatically. Despite any of these recommendations, the only piece of equipment that is actually effective in these things are the masks that are specifically designed to repel the virus. And those are very specific type of masks. Those are the N95 masks that you're talking about. Those aren't just, they're not bandanas, they're not bras, they're not even masks. They are specialty types of masks. And everything else is a relative consideration. So theoretically, if you had a big hawk of spit, excuse the visual there,
No
then
problem.
a mask or a bandana is going to repel that viral droplet. So once again, I told you before that the virus is contained in these, just imagine, if you will, these bubbles. So it's kind of floating around in a bubble. If that bubble is a big spitball and you have on a mask, then you're going to be protected. But the vast majority of exposures are so microscopic that they pass right through even surgical masks. They certainly are going to pass through bras that allow people to breathe, and they certainly are going to sliver through bandanas. The point to be made, and people are interpreting this and going too far with the recommendations that are being made. In a in a worst case scenario, if you don't have anything else, then grab a bandana. If you have a mask, wear the mask. If you don't have two masks, then use the mask and wear it a second time. Those are worst case scenarios, not recommendations, and certainly not preferred scenarios, because that's not effective. And it's not effective at the beginning of the conversation for all circumstances in which people will be exposed to the virus. That's why you need those pieces of personal protective equipment.
People are saying washing your hands. Even you mentioned it. Cover your mouth when you cough. When someone cough or sneeze in a room, panic ensues. What is the proper way to cover your mouth, or if someone sneezes using their clothes, because the germs can still be on your clothes? What is the proper way of covering yourself if you sneeze or cough, covering your mouth with your clothes or whatever? What you should do, like, first describe what is the proper way of covering a cough or a sneeze, and if you cough or sneeze on your clothes, what should someone do with the clothing items after they wore the clothes?
Yeah, well, once again, this is a relative consideration. It's not an absolute consideration. So let's just take it from the top. If you sneeze, we want you sneezing in your elbow, because the crease in your elbow is a place that you're not likely to touch subsequent to having sneezed in it. But it is certainly true that, imagine, if you will, if I sneeze into my elbow and then rub the crease of my elbow onto somebody else's mouth, that contact could produce transmission of the disease. So the reason why you're sneezing into your elbow is simply to reduce the risk of subsequent transmission. You are correct. It is certainly true that that sneeze can propel virus droplets around, above, and below the area in which you sneezed. So, that's to be appreciated and respected. If you hear somebody sneeze, believe me when I tell you, the correct response is to turn your head in the other direction, not toward the person that's sneezing, because a sneeze is actually an involuntary reflex. And if you turn your head in the direction of somebody sneezing and they didn't cover their mouth and sneezed right at you, then all you've done is put yourself in a position to inhale whatever it is they're sneezing your way. So, the angst and the disgust that people have and are directing at people who dare to sneeze, that's not the right attitude to take. We do have to emphasize to people that they should be covering their mouths with their elbows and washing. Actually, one of the things that is not being said nearly enough in these conversations is that when people wash, especially those people who have been sneezing, well, heck, if you sneezed into your elbow, next chance you get, make sure you wash your hands all the way up to your arms, into the area where you actually sneezed. Kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So, the point of the matter is that we just use our hands so much more frequently than we do the creases of our elbow. We just want to avoid coughing into the area that is more likely to be put in our nose and our mouth and on our eyes for subsequent transmission.
And what to do with the clothes, if you sneeze, or on the clothing items?
Well, I mean, you need to wash them. It's just that simple. You don't have to worry about secondhand clothes to other pieces of clothing contacts, and then et cetera. You need to very carefully bundle your clothes, put them in whatever garments you use to separate them out. And then when it comes time to wash your clothing, do what it is you do, and that'll deactivate the virus and it'll take care of it.
You mentioned on your Facebook page, why hasn't the government deployed the Defense Production Act that would include medical professionals and the public with face masks, respirators, ventilators, tests directed to the commander in chief. Can you elaborate on that? Because right now, as we speak, the state of Illinois really doesn't have testing material to test the coronavirus. Can you elaborate what is the Defense Production Act? And according to recent reports, before we went on the air, the president still hasn't acted on this act yet, even though members of the House said, please do so, including
Well,
governors as well.
yeah, the governor has teed it up and said that he was going to do so, but he has not yet activated it. And he has subsequently said that even though he publicly stated that he was going to do so, he now has put the apparatus in place. In the event that he chooses to activate it, it'll be promptly teed up. That actually is not the same as having activated it, so it's not been put in place. Instead, what they are claiming is that they don't need to activate it because, in effect, they've been talking with certain preferred, be dangerous about that word, be careful about the use of that word, corporations, and have worked with the private industry to increase the numbers of medical supplies and equipment and other such things. Getting back to your original question, the point is that, during World War II, most notably, when, you've heard the phrase war economy before, and there simply is a need to ramp up production of direct and indirect products that stimulate the economy and stimulate the country's ability to respond to, in that example, war needs, and in this example, medical needs. So the thought was that the government would be interested in knowing the full scope of the disease and its potential impact on our country. So the Defense Protection Act would help us by ordering all types of pieces of medical equipment. You ran through the list, much of the list, and we would be in a state of readiness. So we would actually be ahead of the curve in having more tests and more pieces of equipment than we would need, instead of this pandemic spiraling out of control, us not having enough pieces of equipment. Then you hear about physicians and nurses and other individuals dying because they're on the front line and are being asked to use these pieces of equipment more than one time, which is inappropriate. And we're trying to play catch up at that point. It is an unconscionable way to treat members of the medical community who literally are putting their lives on the line to take care of these patients and are overwhelmed in fighting this war on the front lines without equipment. Certainly, if this was happening within the military, the amount of angst would be overwhelming. And I would dare say that this situation is no different than that. So I continue to make calls for implementation of the DPA and to, at the very least, ramp up supply levels such that the workers on the front line in the essential services, on the essential services list, actually can get what it is they need. And we should have a goal for full disclosure. We should want to know the scope of the disease in the community so that we can know what the risk is to the most vulnerable of our citizens. But that is not consistent with the government's view at this point, and efforts to minimize the total risk and to simply focus on the relatively low death toll as a means of obscuring the entire scope of this appear to be the preferred way to go right now.
According to your Facebook, you have mentioned that there is an effective way of obtaining a complete data set of the scope of the problem in coronavirus as a means of directing effective management and treatment. Can you explain that to us and how the state of Illinois can use your suggestion and implement it?
Sure. So once again, you have to quantify the threat in order to most effectively address it. First of all, there needs to be a better level of respect for this disease. We don't throw around the word pandemic lightly. And each of the last several times that a pandemic has been declared worldwide, there have been over 1 million deaths. That's a serious thing. We responded incredibly well to the HIV/AIDS pandemic to the extent to where we not only now see a diminishing in the cases, but we have actually engaged the apparatus such that we now have medications that can use. That's why you engage industry, because all types of peripheral and primary benefits arise when you do that. So in quantifying the number, and that only occurs if you have enough tests to quantify the disease, you can then point out to individuals, you need to be isolated, you need to be quarantined. You in this community that has no high risk individuals and has no incidences of coronavirus, you actually may be able. This is part of what everybody wants. There are some communities that may be able to engage in a limited return to work strategy because the risk is low, the influx and egress out of those communities is low. And we want people to get back to normalcy. But if you don't do that in a way that's being guided by epidemiologic data, then to do so is irresponsible and lends itself to a seesawing of the coronavirus drops down, then it pops back up again. That's part of what you're seeing now in places like China and South Korea, where when the effective measures have been put in place with isolation and, the mix of isolation and testing, the numbers shoot down. But if you come out of that prematurely, then you run the risk of the virus reappearing. And all of that is predictable and foreseeable based on not having quantified it at the beginning of the conversation.
Can officials use closed down school facilities as a means of additional isolation unit or assisting the homeless from getting the virus? What are your thoughts regarding that suggestion? Because right now the Chicago is using the Hilton and the Hyatt Hotel to house the homeless, and I'm saying this is just my question. You have 54 schools that's been shut down in Chicago, and you have Cook County sheriffs thinking about, you know, there's inmates that's being infected by the virus, as well as the guards that's protecting them, they're being infected. So what about close down school facilities to house them as they look for facilities? Because a lot of people are saying they don't have no room, they don't have no hospital beds, they don't have no room, but they're not talking about close down school facilities that could actually be some type of resource to house the homeless and help the jail population who's been infected by it. What are your thoughts on that or suggestions?
I think it's a fabulous idea, but I can do you even better. There are closed down hospitals. There's Westlake. There's the facility in the south suburbs. There are closed down hospitals that exist, recently closed down hospitals that have medical equipment and supplies in them that can very easily be reopened for the purpose, of addressing coronavirus. Representative Chris Emmanuel Welsh has actually made this proposal, and I think it's an absolute fantastic way to go. I think that what the city just did today in announcing that the homeless population was going to be taken off the street, and they rent out, I believe, 1,000 hotel rooms to move them out of harm's way, is a fabulous additional idea. So some combination of empty, closed hotels, schools, and hospitals is just an innovative and fantastic way to go. We don't have to overcrowd acute care hospitals when there are other places that have been built for the specific purpose that can actually be used. I'm all for it.
What are your thoughts regarding the mental state of people throughout this pandemic crisis? Because if you cough, people's like, oh no, then you have what's her name? I forgot her name, saying, going on social media. I forgot her name. I is drawing a blank, but she's like, coronavirus, coronavirus, and people are just starting up the fear. What would you say about the mental state of the people throughout this pandemic?
Well, there's a huge range of people and behaviors, and I don't want to amplify the voices of um, the rare individual that doesn't represent the majority. I think that overall, the community, the citizenry of Americans has responded way better than anyone would have projected. We have performed way better relative to how the government has um, done what its responsibility in this should have been, historically has been. And so I just want to continue to applaud folks and to compel folks to continue with what really are some basic, you already should have been doing this type of considerations. This is not the most difficult challenge we've had. Even now, what's really being asked of folks is to stay home, socially isolate, learn how to cough, learn how to wash your hands. It's not that much to ask. And amongst those basic measures, people really have done well. And there haven't been mass riots and uprisings. People haven't even really held the government accountable for doing everything that it could do. But of course, there are going to be a couple of bad apples in every bunch, and I don't want to magnify that. You could have done what China did, for example, and there's the crazy, I don't know if it's rumor or just an attempt at humor, where in Russia they allegedly have 500 lions roaming the street to disincentivize people from coming out. There's all different levels of martial law. As a matter of fact, the UK just implemented some pretty stringent guidelines and will enforce non-compliers, non-conformists to the new rules. So things could have been a lot more of a crackdown here. But even without that, folks have done well, and I just want to continue to encourage people to do that and to put in place whatever measures are necessary to address the occasional person that licks a pole and screams coronavirus. They need to be arrested and dealt with, and for the most part, I believe some of that has been occurring.
What products or soap products you recommend that people could use to be more safe throughout this pandemic? Because a lot of people say hand sanitizers. You have a lot of hand sanitizers that's out there. You have a lot of hand soap that's out there. People say buy Lysol. You have the cheap version of Lysol or something like that. What are your best solutions or recommendations for products? Hello?
If people want to go overboard and spend more money for what amounts to a distinction without a difference, that's fine. But Lysol is a branded product. If you look at the ingredients in Lysol, it's basically any disinfectant. A disinfectant is effective, and as long as it's meeting the baseline, then you don't need a branded Lysol or you don't need a branded super duper disinfectant or a extra special soap. With washing your hands, just the simple act of water, for those that can't afford that, the act of running water gets you 95% of the way there. So, it's all about contact time. And if you get yourself soap, you're going to effectively disinfect everything that's out there trying to bother you. So I'm not in the habit of trying to convince people that they need to start stocking up on supplements and vitamins and extra special sanitizers and soaps. Common things happen commonly, and the basics are really what you need to engage in. Be more focused on complying with drilling deep on the 3 or 4 basic components of protecting yourself and getting esoteric and fancy and worrying about whether if this product, which is 5 times more expensive, gives you 1% more effectiveness in hand washing. That's not where our focus should be.
You are listening to intellectualradio.com/iHeartRadio station, The Drive at 5. On the intellectual line, we have Dr. Jeffrey Sterling. The topic is the coronavirus aka COVID-19, please give intellectualradio.com/iHeartRadio station where they can get in contact with you, Dr. Sterling.
The easiest way is to visit us at jeffreysterlingmd.com. That will lead you to our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram links. We are posting daily videos over on Instagram, and we're doing daily question of the day posts over on Facebook. You can hit me at Ask Sterling MD. That's my handle. And obviously, as I said, jeffreysterlingmd.com. We do a blog called Straight No Chaser that goes out, that gives you information on any and everything related to health. It's all about patient empowerment. We want you to be better stewards of your own health, and we'll get you there. So feel free to visit, and wishing everyone the best.
All right. Thank you. Don't be a stranger to the Drive at 5. We appreciate you. Thank you for the information, sir.
All right. Always great talking to you.
All right. Thank you. That's going to do it for us on the Drive at 5 on intellectualradio.com/iHeartRadio station. Thanks to our executive producer, Earl Winfrey. Wanda, who's behind the scenes. You guys stay safe out there. Please don't panic. Have a good week, everyone.